1930, Harlem, New York. A woman runs an empire worth more than most banks in the neighborhood, and she runs it without a single man's name on the paperwork. The streets call her Madam Queenie. The police can't touch her, not for lack of trying. The Italian mob wants her territory, and they're getting louder about it every year. And on any given day, in any room she walks into, she has exactly one rule for the men who work for her. Prove you're smarter than everyone else in the room, or find somewhere else to stand. One young man is about to prove it. His name is Ellsworth Johnson. History will remember him by a different name, Bumpy. But before he was the most feared man in Harlem, before the Italian Mafia learned to negotiate with him instead of against him, before a young Malcolm X trusted him with things he trusted almost no one else with, Bumpy Johnson was nobody. Just another young man trying to survive in a city that wasn't built to let him. This is the story of how a queen built a king, and why almost nobody talks about the woman who did it. To understand what Stephanie St. Clair saw in Bumpy Johnson, you first have to understand what kind of woman Stephanie St. Clair was, because by the time Bumpy crossed her path, she was already one of the most powerful and most dangerous people in New York City, and almost nobody outside Harlem knew her name. She was born on the island of Martinique, in the French Caribbean, and by most accounts, she arrived in New York sometime in the 1910s, one more immigrant in a city that swallowed people whole. She had no family fortune waiting for her, no connections, no protection. What she had was a mind that worked faster than the men around her expected it to, and she used that from the very beginning. By the 1920s, Stephanie St. Clair had built something almost nobody believed a woman, let alone a black immigrant woman, could build in that era. She ran the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that was, in practice, the financial backbone of everyday Harlem. Working people who couldn't get a loan from a bank, who couldn't buy stock, who had no path into the wider American economy, could put down a nickel or a dime on a number and dream. It sounds small. It wasn't. At the height of her operation, Stephanie St. Clair's numbers business was pulling in an amount of money that would rival a small regional bank, all of it moving through a network she controlled, protected, and expanded, year after year, in a city that would have preferred she didn't exist at all. What made her different wasn't just the money, it was how she protected it. Most people in her position paid off the police and stayed quiet, hoping nobody looked too closely. Stephanie St. Clair did something almost nobody in her line of work would dare to do. She took out newspaper advertisements, public ones, naming the corrupt police officers who were shaking down her operation, exposing exactly how much they were demanding and from whom. She testified on the record about police corruption in Harlem at a time when doing so could have gotten her killed, arrested on false charges, or worse. She wasn't hiding from the system, she was daring it to come after her in the open, because she understood something most people in the underworld never grasp. Fear works both ways. If the police were afraid of what she might expose next, they'd think twice before pushing too hard. That's the woman Harlem called Madam Queenie, not because anyone gave her that name as a gift, but because she took it, the same way she took everything else, and made it hers. By the early 1930s, though, Stephanie St. Clair had a problem that no newspaper advertisement could fix. The Italian-American mob, led by men like Dutch Schultz, had noticed exactly how much money was moving through Harlem's numbers racket, and they wanted it. Not a cut of it, all of it. And they were prepared to use violence to take it, the kind of violence that didn't care whose name was on the operation or how many corrupt cops you'd already exposed. Stephanie St. Clair needed something she'd never needed before. Not just loyal men, not just muscle. She needed someone who could think 2, 3, 4 moves ahead of men who had spent their entire lives thinking in exactly that way. She needed a mind, wrapped in a body nobody would think twice about underestimating, and in a city of millions, that combination was rarer than money. That's when Ellsworth Johnson walked into her world. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1905, and his early life gave no obvious sign of the man he'd become. As a teenager, after trouble back home that different accounts describe differently, he made his way north to live with his sister in Harlem, the way so many young black men did during that era, chasing the same promise the whole Great Migration was chasing, a chance at something better than what the South had offered. What he found instead, at first, was the bottom rung of the numbers racket, a runner, a collector, the kind of job that put him on the street corners of Harlem every single day, moving small bets and a little more money for people who barely knew his name, in an operation that belonged to a woman he probably hadn't even met yet. Nobody remembers the names of most of the men who did that job. It was replaceable work, done by replaceable people, in an operation that needed dozens of them just to function. But somewhere in those early years, something happened that made Stephanie St. Clair start paying attention to one particular runner, and while the exact details of how she first noticed him have been dramatized and retold so many times that historians can't always separate fact from legend, the pattern is consistent across every account. He didn't panic under pressure. He didn't talk when silence would serve him better. When trouble came looking for the operation, he handled it the way a much older, much more experienced man would have, calm, deliberate, thinking 3 steps past the immediate problem in front of him. Most people who worked for the Queen were replaceable, and she knew it because she'd built her empire assuming exactly that. Bumpy wasn't, and the moment she realized it, everything about his future changed. What she did next is one of the most remarkable parts of this entire story, and it's the part that gets left out of almost every dramatized retelling of Bumpy Johnson's life. She didn't just promote him, she educated him. By multiple accounts, Stephanie St. Clair personally took an interest in shaping the mind of the young man working under her, introducing him to books, to poetry, to the strategic thinking of chess, treating him less like an employee and more like an apprentice being groomed for something much bigger than collecting bets on a Harlem street corner. This is the detail that changes the entire shape of the Bumpy Johnson legend, because the man history remembers as one of the most calculating, most respected power brokers in the history of American organized crime wasn't born that way. He was built that way, deliberately, by a woman who saw something in him before almost anyone else did, and who understood that in the war that was coming, brute force alone was never going to be enough. Because the war was coming. By the mid-1930s, Dutch Schultz had stopped circling Harlem's numbers racket and started moving directly against it, using intimidation, violence, and the full weight of an organized crime network that dwarfed anything Stephanie St. Clair could match man for man, gun for gun. Most operators in her position would have folded, taken a smaller cut, and lived to keep some portion of what they'd built. Stephanie St. Clair refused, publicly, the same way she'd refused to quietly accept police corruption years earlier, and once again she chose unconventional weapons over conventional ones, public exposure, strategic alliances, and, increasingly, a young enforcer who had learned to think the way she thought. This was the apprenticeship, not a single dramatic moment, but years of it, Bumpy rising through her organization, while the pressure from Dutch Schultz and the wider Italian-American mob kept building around them both. He became her protector as much as her student, standing in rooms that could have ended violently, using the same calculated patience she'd spent years teaching him to hold on to, even when everyone around him expected him to reach for something else first. The chess metaphor isn't just a nice narrative device here. By several accounts, it was literal. Stephanie St. Clair taught him to play, and to think several moves ahead the way the game demands, and that skill became so central to how people described him in later decades that Bumpy Johnson would eventually be nicknamed, by friends and rivals alike, something close to the chess master of Harlem, a reputation built not on the streets but at a table, years before anyone outside that room understood what they were watching take shape. She wasn't just preparing him to survive Dutch Schultz, she was preparing him to outlast every single man who'd come looking for Harlem after Schultz was gone, and there would be many of them, for the next 3 decades. Dutch Schultz himself didn't survive 1935. He was killed, not by Stephanie St. Clair's organization, but by his own associates, caught up in the wider politics and power struggles of organized crime at the time, a detail history records plainly, without needing any dramatization at all. And with his death, the landscape of Harlem's underworld shifted, permanently. Stephanie St. Clair remained a figure of enormous respect in the years that followed, but the center of gravity in Harlem's underworld was moving, quietly, toward the man she'd built. Through the 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s, it was Bumpy Johnson who increasingly became the face of power in that world. The man other operators negotiated with, the man rival organizations learned to approach carefully, the man history would eventually remember as untouchable. And this is where the story closes the loop, all the way back to where it started. Every legend that gets told about Bumpy Johnson standing his ground against the Italian Mafia, every story about the Genovese family or the Gambino family learning to respect a man they couldn't simply push aside, every account of him earning the trust of a young Malcolm X during a period when trust was the rarest currency in Harlem, all of it traces back to a lesson taught a decade earlier by a woman most people have never heard of. Never let anyone see you as just muscle. Think further ahead than the man across the table thinks you're capable of thinking. That was Stephanie St. Clair's rule, and it became Bumpy Johnson's entire reputation. Stephanie St. Clair herself faded from public memory in a way her student never did. She lived out her later years with far less mythology attached to her name than the man she'd mentored, and today, most people who know the name Bumpy Johnson, most people who've watched the shows or the documentaries built around his legend, have never heard hers at all. But every single story about Bumpy Johnson, every dramatization, every documentary, every legend about the smartest, most calculating man in Harlem's underworld starts in the same place, with a lesson only one woman was willing to teach him, at a time when almost nobody believed a woman like her could build an empire in the first place, let alone build the man who would go on to defend it long after she'd stepped back from the fight herself. If you want the rest of it, if you want to see exactly what happened when the Mafia finally tested what she taught him, stay close, because that part of the story is coming next, and it's the part most people think they already know, until they hear how it actually happened.